My name is Daniel Cole, and I used to believe that blood was thicker than water. I used to believe that no matter what happened, family would always have my back. I was wrong. Dead wrong. On the night of my 18th birthday, my own father stood in the doorway of the only home I had ever known, pointed at the driveway, and told me to get out. Not because I had done anything wrong. Not because I had broken any law. But because I refused to become the son he wanted me to be. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the boy they threw out into the rain that night would one day hold their entire future in his hands. This is the story of how I lost everything, built myself back up from nothing, and how, years later, the same family that slammed the door in my face came crawling back, begging me to save them. Stay with me till the end, because the way this story ends, you will not see coming. Part 1, The Golden Cage. To understand how I ended up standing in the rain with a duffel bag and $40 in my pocket, you need to understand the family I came from. The Coles were old money. My grandfather built a shipping and logistics empire from a single rusted truck in the 1960s, and by the time I was born, that single truck had become a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We lived in a gated estate outside the city, the kind of house with a circular driveway, a wine cellar, and a staff that outnumbered the actual family members living inside it. My father, Richard Cole, ran the company with an iron fist. My mother, Vivian, ran our household with the same precision, the same coldness. Everything in that house had a purpose, a place, an expectation. And I was expected to be the heir. The next Cole to sit at the head of the boardroom table. The next Cole to shake hands with senators and mayors at charity galas while smiling for the cameras. There was just one problem. I didn't want any of it. From the time I was maybe 12 years old, I found myself drawn to something my father considered beneath us: computers. Not the polished, corporate version of technology that ran our shipping logistics, but the raw, messy, creative side of it. Building things. Breaking things. Writing code late into the night by the light of a laptop I'd bought myself with money I earned mowing neighbors' lawns, because God forbid my allowance be used for something so impractical. My older sister, Margaret, was the golden child. 3 years older than me, sharp, ambitious, and endlessly obedient. She wanted the empire. She wanted the boardroom. She fit perfectly into the mold our parents had built, and because of that, she could do no wrong in their eyes. I, on the other hand, was a disappointment before I ever did anything to earn the label. I remember being maybe 14 years old, sitting at the dinner table, when my father slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were brochures for a military boarding school 3 states away. "This will fix the daydreaming," he said, not even looking up from his plate. "You need discipline, not distractions." I didn't go, not that time. My mother intervened, not out of love, but because she thought it would look bad to the neighbors if the youngest Cole was suddenly shipped off. But the message was clear, even then. I was not being raised. I was being managed. A problem to be corrected, not a son to be understood. By the time I turned 16, I had already built and sold 2 small mobile apps, nothing groundbreaking, simple utility tools, but enough to earn a few $1,000s and a small write-up in a local tech blog. I remember running into the house that day, practically vibrating with excitement, wanting so badly to show my father the article, to finally have him look at me the way he looked at Margaret when she brought home a straight A report card. He glanced at the screen for maybe 3 seconds. "Cute hobby," he said. "Now go get changed, we have the Whitmore dinner in an hour." That was it. 3 seconds. Cute hobby. I stopped trying to impress him after that. Not out of rebellion, at least not at first, but out of a quiet kind of grief. I realized, somewhere around 16, that no version of me that existed outside of his blueprint would ever be enough. So I stopped chasing his approval, and I started building something quietly, secretly, for myself. Part 2, the night everything changed. By my senior year of high school, I had been accepted into a competitive computer science program at a university across the country, one that had nothing to do with the business school my father had already picked out for me, the one with the Cole name practically engraved on a scholarship fund plaque in the lobby. I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone except my mother's assistant, who helped me quietly manage the financial aid paperwork, because I knew, deep down, this conversation would not go well. The night everything fell apart was my 18th birthday. There was a dinner, of course there was always a dinner, always an audience of business partners and family friends, always a performance to put on. Somewhere between the champagne toast and the cake, my father asked, in front of nearly 30 guests, when I would be starting my internship at Cole Logistics that summer, the internship that was supposed to be the first official step toward taking over the company one day. I could have lied. I could have deflected, bought myself another few months of peace. But something in me, some exhausted, 18 years in the making part of me, decided I was done pretending. I'm not doing the internship, I said. I got into a computer science program. I'm going to study software engineering. The table went silent. My mother's smile froze in place like a mask cracking at the edges. My sister Margaret looked down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes, and my father set down his fork very slowly, very deliberately, and asked everyone to give us the room. What followed, once the guests had gone, was not a conversation. It was an ultimatum. He told me that if I walked away from the company, I was walking away from the family. He told me that the Cole name meant something, that it wasn't mine to throw away on some fantasy about coding apps in a basement. He told me that everything, the house, the tuition, the trust fund set up in my name since birth, all of it existed under one condition, that I follow the path that had been laid out for me since the day I was born. I told him I couldn't do that. I told him I didn't want the company. I wanted to build my own life. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who had wandered uninvited into your home. Then you can build it somewhere else, he said. Because you are not doing it under my roof. My mother didn't defend me. Margaret didn't defend me. I remember standing in that marble foyer, rain hammering against the tall windows, as my father instructed the housekeeper to bring down one bag of my belongings. Not the childhood photos. Not the awards. Not even most of my clothes. One bag. The car service will take you to a motel for the night, he said, already turning away, already done with me. After that, you're on your own. I stood on that driveway in the pouring rain, 18 years old, $43 in my wallet, watching the front door of the only home I'd ever known close behind me. And nobody came after me. Not my mother. Not my sister. Nobody. That was the last night I slept under the Cole roof. Part 3, starting from nothing. People love to romanticize the idea of starting from nothing, but there is nothing romantic about being 18, alone, and terrified in a city where you know almost no one. That first month was the hardest of my life. I slept on a friend's couch for a few weeks, a kid named Marcus I'd known from a coding forum, until even that goodwill started running thin. I took a job stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, then walk to a diner in the mornings to wash dishes for cash under the table. I remember doing math in my head constantly: rent, food, the tiny sliver of a laptop repair fund, trying to stretch $43 into something that could last. My university acceptance was still intact, and thanks to the financial aid I had quietly secured months earlier, tuition wasn't the immediate crisis. But everything else: housing, food, basic survival, none of that came with a scholarship. I remember calling my mother once, about 6 weeks in, more out of desperation than hope. I asked, carefully, quietly, if there was any way she could help, even just a little, just until I got on my feet. She was silent for a long moment before she said, "Your father would never allow it," and hung up the phone. I never called again. I threw myself into two things during those years: survival, and code. Between shifts and classes, I started freelancing, building small websites for local businesses, fixing bugs for other students' projects, anything that paid. I slept maybe 5 hours a night for the better part of 2 years. I ate more instant noodles than I care to admit. There were nights I genuinely wondered if I had made a catastrophic mistake, if my father had been right, if I was going to fail spectacularly and prove every doubt he'd ever had about me. But somewhere in my second year of university, something shifted. A small tool I built, a simple piece of software that helped small logistics companies track and optimize local delivery routes, something almost embarrassingly close to the industry I had run away from, started gaining traction. I hadn't built it to compete with my father's company. I had built it because I understood the pain points of small shipping businesses from years of half listening to boardroom conversations I never wanted to be part of. Turns out, that knowledge was valuable. A local delivery company paid me for a custom version. Then another. Then a regional client. By my final year of university, what had started as a freelance side project had become a real company: Coleman Logistics Software, named quietly after my mother's maiden name, not my father's, a detail I chose very deliberately. I'm not going to pretend it was an overnight fairy tale. There were failed contracts, a business partner who tried to push me out of my own company, a year where I nearly lost everything to a lawsuit from a client who claimed breach of contract. I fought through every single one of those battles alone, without a family safety net, without a trust fund, without a single phone call home for help. By the time I turned 26, Coleman Logistics Software had grown into a genuine mid-sized company, providing route optimization and supply chain software to over 300 businesses across the country. I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't on magazine covers. But I had built something real, something entirely mine, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of a family that had thrown me away. And during all those years, I heard almost nothing from the Coles. The occasional mutual acquaintance mentioned that Margaret had officially taken over as VP of Operations at Cole Logistics. That my father was slowing down, handing over more control. That my mother had thrown herself into charity board positions, the kind reserved for women whose husbands didn't need them working anymore. I told myself I didn't care. Most days, I even believed it. Part 4, Cracks in the Empire. Empires don't fall overnight. They erode, slowly, quietly, until one day the cracks are too big to hide. I didn't learn the details right away. I had built a life deliberately far from Cole Logistics, and I intended to keep it that way. But industry gossip travels, especially in logistics and shipping circles, and eventually, pieces of the story reached me through clients, former colleagues, and a very talkative accountant I'd worked with years earlier who had once done freelance work for my father's company. It turned out that Cole Logistics had made a series of aggressive expansion decisions in the years after I left: new warehouses, an ambitious international shipping contract, a massive investment into outdated tracking technology that never modernized properly. My father, it seemed, had grown increasingly resistant to change, clinging to old systems, old partnerships, old ways of doing business in an industry that was evolving rapidly around him. Margaret, despite her ambition, had been given authority but never real independence. My father still made every major decision, still overruled her at every turn, still ran the company like it was 1985. And slowly, competitors who had adapted to modern logistics software very similar, ironically, to what my own company specialized in began eating into coal logistics market share. Then came the real blow. A massive shipping contract, one that made up nearly a third of the company's annual revenue, was lost to a competitor who could offer faster, more accurate, technology-driven delivery tracking. Coal logistics simply couldn't compete with outdated systems. Layoffs followed. Then a second round of layoffs. Then rumors of the company quietly shopping for emergency investors. I want to be honest with you, when I first heard this news, I felt something complicated. Not joy, exactly. Not quite satisfaction either. Something closer to a strange, hollow validation. The company that had valued its legacy and its name over its own son was now struggling to survive in a world it had refused to adapt to. I went back to my own work. My own company. My own life. I told myself, again, that none of it was my problem anymore. I was wrong about that too. Part 5, The Phone Call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, nearly 8 years after that rainy night on the driveway, when my assistant told me a woman named Vivian Cole was on the line, insisting it was urgent, insisting she needed to speak with me directly. My mother's voice hadn't changed. Still poised, still carefully controlled, even as I could hear something underneath it, something I had never once heard from her in my entire childhood. Fear. She didn't apologize, not at first. Instead, she asked about my company, complimented my success in a tone that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the words in a mirror before dialing. I let her talk. I didn't fill the silences. Eventually, she got to the point. Coal logistics was in serious trouble. Real trouble, the kind of trouble where the bank was calling in loans, where investors were pulling out, where the family estate, the very house I had been thrown out of in the rain, had been quietly used as collateral against company debt. My father, she admitted, had suffered a minor heart attack under the stress 6 months earlier, and had stepped back from day-to-day operations. Margaret was drowning, trying to keep the company afloat with outdated systems and a board that no longer trusted the family's leadership. And then she said the words I never, in a million years, expected to hear from Vivian Cole. "We need your help, Daniel." I sat there in silence for a long moment. Not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say. This was the woman who hadn't defended me at the dinner table. Who hadn't come after me into the rain. Who had told me, 6 weeks into my homelessness, that my father would never allow her to help me, and then hung up the phone. Why me, I finally asked. Her answer was almost painfully honest, more honest than I had ever heard her be. Because you're the only one who understands both worlds. You know the business. And you know technology. You're the only person who could actually fix this. I told her I needed time to think. She didn't argue. I think, on some level, she knew she had no right to. Part 6, The Decision. I spent that night the way I imagine most people would, replaying every memory I had tried very hard to bury. The driveway in the rain. The 3-second glance at my article. The folder for military school slid across the dinner table. The silence from Margaret when I needed just one person, anyone, to speak up for me. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated by their downfall. Part of me wanted to slam the door the way they had slammed it on me, to tell my mother that the Coles could figure out their own mess, that I owed them nothing. But another part of me, a quieter, more complicated part, kept circling back to something my father himself had once said, ironically, at one of those endless business dinners of my childhood: in business, sentiment is a liability, but reputation is an asset. I had spent 8 years building a reputation entirely separate from the Cole name. If I turned my back on them now out of pure spite, wouldn't that just prove every accusation my father had ever made, that I was reckless, that I let emotion cloud judgment, that I couldn't be trusted with something as serious as a company's survival? I decided, that night, that I would help. But not for them. For myself. Because I wanted to walk into that boardroom, the same one I had been groomed my entire childhood to inherit, and fix what they could not fix, not out of forgiveness, but out of proof. Proof that the version of me they threw away in the rain had become exactly the kind of person capable of saving what they couldn't. I called my mother back the next morning and agreed to one meeting, on my terms. Part 7, Walking Back In. I hadn't set foot in the Cole Logistics headquarters since I was 17 years old. Walking through those glass doors again, 8 years later, felt like stepping into a memory that had been left to rot. The lobby, once gleaming, now looked tired: worn carpet, flickering fluorescent lights they clearly couldn't justify replacing, a nearly empty reception desk where 3 staff members used to sit. The energy of the place had changed entirely. Gone was the confident hum of an empire, in its place was the quiet anxiety of a company holding its breath. Margaret met me at the elevator. She looked older than her 31 years, dark circles under her eyes, a kind of exhaustion that no amount of designer clothing could hide. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "You look good," she finally said, quietly. "You look tired," I said back, not unkindly, just honestly. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah. That tends to happen when you're trying to keep a sinking ship afloat with a crew that refuses to change course." We walked to the boardroom together, the same boardroom I used to sit in as a child, swinging my legs off chairs too tall for me, bored out of my mind while my father discussed contracts I didn't understand. Now, sitting at the head of that same table, was my father. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, though the heart attack had clearly taken something out of him, but smaller in presence, in authority. The man who once filled a room with the force of his certainty now looked like someone waiting for a verdict. "Daniel," he said, and for the first time in my entire life, I heard something in his voice that wasn't command or disappointment. It was almost humility. I sat down across from him, not beside him, a small detail I chose deliberately. "Let's talk business," I said. "Because that's the only reason I'm here." Part 8, Laying Out the Truth. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret walked me through the company's financials, and it was worse than the rumors had suggested. Outdated tracking systems that hadn't been updated in over a decade. Contracts lost to competitors using real-time route optimization technology, the exact kind of software my own company specialized in. A workforce demoralized by 2 rounds of layoffs. Debt piling up against an estate that had been in the family for 3 generations. I asked questions. Hard ones. Not out of cruelty, but because that's what the situation demanded. I asked why they hadn't modernized their systems years earlier when the industry shift was obvious to anyone paying attention. I asked why the board hadn't pushed back sooner against my father's resistance to change. I asked Margaret directly why, given her position as VP of Operations, she hadn't fought harder to implement newer technology. Her answer surprised me. "I tried," she said quietly, glancing briefly at our father. "For years, I tried, but every time I brought in a proposal for modernization, it got shut down. We built this company on relationships, not algorithms," he'd say. I wasn't allowed to make the changes I knew we needed. I looked at my father. He didn't defend himself. He simply sat there, hands folded, staring at the table like a man finally confronting the cost of his own stubbornness. "I could fix this," I finally said. "My company has spent 8 years building exactly the kind of logistics technology you need. Real-time tracking, route optimization, predictive delivery software. I could integrate it into coal logistics and very likely save this company." Relief flickered across my mother's face, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Margaret exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. My father simply nodded, slowly, like a man accepting a diagnosis he already suspected. "But," I continued, "I'm not doing this for free. And I'm not doing this as your son walking back into the family business. I'm doing this as a business owner, entering a formal partnership, under my terms." Part 9, The Terms. I laid out my conditions clearly, without emotion, the same way I would with any struggling client. First, Coleman Logistics Software would take a significant equity stake in coal logistics in exchange for integrating our technology and consulting services, not a favor, not charity, a real business deal with real ownership attached. Second, my father would step down entirely from operational decision-making. He could remain a board member, a figurehead if the family wanted to preserve appearances, but he would have no authority over technology decisions, hiring, or day-to-day operations going forward. Third, Margaret would remain in leadership, but this time with actual authority to implement the changes she had been fighting for all along, backed by my company's resources and expertise. And fourth, this was the condition that made the room go completely silent. I wanted the family estate removed as collateral from any company debt, restructured through legitimate refinancing that didn't put a family home at risk for business decisions. Not because I wanted the house. I never wanted that house again. But because I understood now what it meant for a family to lose everything, and even after everything they had done, I didn't want to be the reason it happened to them. My father was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time in my entire life, he said the words I had waited 18 years to hear. "I was wrong about you," he said, voice rough. "I was wrong about a lot of things." I didn't respond right away. Some wounds don't close just because someone finally acknowledges them. "I'm not doing this so you can feel forgiven," I said honestly. "I'm doing this because it's the right business decision, and because despite everything, I don't want to watch this company or this family collapse when I have the ability to prevent it, but we are never going back to the way things were. I'm not your heir. I'm a business partner. That's the relationship now." He nodded slowly. "That's more than I deserve." Part 10, Rebuilding, Differently. Over the following year, the integration of my technology into coal logistics transformed the company almost unrecognizably. Real-time tracking systems replaced decade-old software. Route optimization cut delivery costs by nearly 30% within the first 6 months. Client contracts that had been lost to competitors slowly began returning, drawn back by faster, more reliable service. Margaret, finally given real authority, proved to be a sharp, capable leader once she wasn't constantly fighting our father's resistance to change. My father, true to the agreement, stepped back completely. I'll admit, watching him attend board meetings as a quiet, secondary voice rather than the dominant force he'd always been was strange, almost surreal. He wasn't the same man who had once slid a military school brochure across a dinner table. Whether that change came from genuine reflection or simply the exhaustion of nearly losing everything, I honestly couldn't say. Maybe it was both. My mother reached out more, in small, careful ways. Coffee, occasionally. A birthday card, the first one I'd received from her in 8 years. I didn't rush back into a warm relationship with either of my parents, and I won't pretend the years of damage disappeared because a business deal saved the company. Trust, once broken that deeply, rebuilds slowly, if it rebuilds at all. Margaret and I, surprisingly, grew closer than we'd ever been as children. Maybe because we were finally relating to each other as adults, as equals, rather than as the golden child and the disappointment. She apologized, more than once, for her silence that night in the rain, for the years of silence that followed. I told her the truth that I understood, even if it still hurt. She had been a child too, raised in the same rigid system, terrified of becoming the next target if she stepped out of line. As for me, Coleman Logistics Software continued to grow, now with a formal, thriving partnership with the very company that had once cast me out. I never moved back into that estate. I never wanted the life they had originally planned for me. But I built something better, a relationship with my family based on honesty and boundaries, rather than obligation and fear. Closing, the lesson. Looking back now, years after that rainy driveway, I don't think I would change what happened, as strange as that sounds. If my family had never thrown me out, I never would have discovered what I was truly capable of building on my own. I never would have learned my own strength, separate from the Cole name, separate from anyone's approval. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who push you the hardest into becoming who you're meant to be, not because they intended to, but because surviving without them forces you to discover a strength you never knew you had. My family kicked me out with one bag and $43, certain I would fail, certain I would come crawling back within a year, begging for forgiveness and a place back in the family business. Instead, years later, it was them who came back to me, needing what I had built entirely on my own. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it to prove them wrong, even though, in the end, I did. I did it because somewhere between that rainy driveway and that boardroom table, I became someone capable of choosing compassion over bitterness, without ever forgetting what I had survived to get there. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: the people who doubt you, who cast you aside, who tell you that you'll never be enough, sometimes, the best response isn't anger. It's simply becoming so undeniably capable that your success speaks a language they finally have no choice but to understand. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this one.